friend. I'm gonna make a different kind of video today. It's not a tutorial. I think I've only ever made video tutorials, but this one is more of a helpful, I hope, moving into October kind of video for you. So if you've been following my blog, Pin Cut Sew, for any amount of time, you know that costume sewing is my absolute favorite thing ever to sew. So every year since my kids were tiny, I would start asking them what they wanted to be, probably in July or August, so we could spend weeks looking at the new costume patterns, picking what to make, and then obviously making them. So my kids are now teenagers, so I've been doing this for a really long time, and I have some really good tips to offer you if you are making Halloween costumes this year. So I have 5 good tips for Halloween costume sewing and how to do it on the cheap. Because also, if you've been following me for a while, you know that I'm a frugal person, a frugal sewer especially. So there are ways to do this that don't have to cost you a ton of money. So I'm gonna give you tips for that too. Let's get going. Okay, my first tip, these are not necessarily in order of importance, but my first tip is, especially if you're sewing costumes for littler kids who are still in that phase of playing dress up. I don't know about your kids, but mine played dress up constantly when they were young, probably into their early teen years, really, because their friends would dress up and play with all these costumes I had made over the years. So my tip for you, if you're sewing for kids that are going to play dress up with these costumes a lot, make sure you make them really well finished. So if you sew something and you kind of haphazardly toss it together and it has fraying on the inside and it's not finished very well, it's going to fall apart the more that they wear it, obviously. So if you take the extra time to make French seams or serge the seams or zigzag the seams on the inside so it stays together for lots of washes and many years of use, then that will just be more fun in the long run. Of course, there are some costumes that are more like glue projects. You can check out my son's Buzz Lightyear costume. The felt pieces were just totally glued on. And even though he did wear that as dress up and I did wash it a lot of times, obviously it started to fall apart. So that was one of those specific projects that just couldn't really be sewn. But if you can sew it, make it so it will last. Okay, my second tip is my first frugal tip. So if you are stuck on how much the fabrics will cost to make a costume, just go to the thrift store. You can find tons of fabrics in the thrift store, and not necessarily just yardage that's like cut fabric. You need to look in the linen section where you can find sheets and curtains and other kinds of linens, and also you can find clothing that you can use to make your costume. So my son's dyer costume, he was dyer from Fortnite a few years ago, and we went to the thrift store and bought all those parts because basically you have to just tear them up and rip them up. He's like a werewolf character that's all ripped up with fur. And so since we could get all those parts for free or cheap, free if we had them in our closet already, or cheap at the thrift store, then we could spend that extra money on the fur that we needed to go with it. So always go to the thrift store first for fabrics. This leads me to my third tip, which is more sources for cheap fabric. So you can also use felt, which comes really cheap. I made my girls' cupcake costumes. They were so cute when they were toddlers. And since 72-inch wide felt is really cheap per yard, it didn't cost very much at all to make them, even though they took a lot of fabric. Another similar item is fleece. Fleece is pretty cheap and it comes big, so you can make a full costume. I made my son a dinosaur out of fleece, and it wasn't expensive to make because the fabric was inexpensive. Third, most fabric stores have sections of costume fabrics that are really cheap. So no one's gonna use bridal satin for their daughter's princess dress because it's expensive and it would just cost too much. So you can go over to the fabric section though, and they have costume satin that's just a few dollars a yard, so it's cheap. And if you finish the insides well, like I said in tip number 1, then it will still last a really long time. And also, kids don't care if their satin is thick or thin. And then of course, thrifted fabrics, especially the curtain section, if you're making any historical costumes, like for example, if you're gonna make like one of the Hamilton dresses like I blogged about last year, you can find like those brocade looking fabrics in the curtain section at the thrift store that would cost you a fortune to buy off the shelf, off the bolt in the upholstery fabric section. So those are my tips for shopping for cheap supplies. To think outside of the costume pattern box. Of course, sometimes your child will say, I want to be Merida from Brave, and you can find a Merida costume pattern because that's a popular princess and you can find the pattern and just make it as is. But not everything is like that. If your child wants to be some obscure Fortnite character, you might have more trouble. So if you think about the costume, just break it down into parts. Like for example, my daughter wanted to be Eliza Doolittle in a very specific one of her costumes a few years ago. And so obviously we can't go shopping for an Eliza Doolittle costume, especially not for that particular outfit she wanted to be, but we could break it down into a button-down skirt pattern, which I already had, a ruffled shirt pattern that I could get easily, and then also a cropped jacket, which I altered when I already had. So if you break it down into components, think outside of just the costume patterns you can buy as is, but try to see what you already have. That's another tip for frugal sewing for costumes. See what you already have that you can adapt to work, and try to envision them in the right fabrics. And even if it's not exactly right, with the right fabric, it will look right anyway. You might not have time or the desire to sew a costume totally from scratch. And in this case, you can utilize ready-made garments like sweats, hoodies, sweatshirts, leggings, t-shirts. Even in my daughter's Starbucks barista costume, you can get aprons and visors in pretty much any color that's plain, and then you can embellish them. This year my daughter's going to be the Cowardly Lion. They're doing a group costume, her and my other daughter and 2 friends, and she's just going to get tan colored a hoodie and sweats that match, and if you add a mane and a tail, then it'll be perfect, and then it'll be low cost and low stress. So you can try to use ready-made pieces. You might even have some in your closet already that will work. So those are my best tips for sewing Halloween costumes. I've sewn so many of them over the years, so you definitely want to go check out the blog post I'm going to link you to below so you can see all of the costumes that I've made, or most of them anyway, as many as I could find photos for. Also, be sure and like this video, subscribe to my channel so you don't miss anything new. I post new tutorials and sewing tips and inspiration all the time, both here and on my blog, pincutsewstudio.com. You can also find me on Instagram at pincutsew, and don't forget to shop my sewing patterns on the Pin Cut Sew Etsy shop. So I'll see you soon. Happy Halloween sewing!